1957 saw the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As the name implies, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there is in the ideas and actions of this organization certainly a religious connection. Martin Luther King Jr. is the iconic figure, a leader, if you will, of the SCLC. And he is, of course, a Baptist minister. But more importantly, I think, the SCLC relied heavily on local ministers throughout the nation. And King himself had developed a resistance mentality or resistance methodology, which drew heavily on religious tradition. I had mentioned earlier his work in graduate school on Gandhi and his own work in theology and the theology of social justice, or the demands for social justice that flow from religious thought. And so he's bringing all of this to the table. And yet it's also worth noting that oftentimes there was resistance, particularly in the South, but elsewhere as well, resistance among religious leaders to the SCLC and to King undertaking acts of passive resistance or civil disobedience in various locations. Really a very small percentage of ministers who usually would support the actions of the SCLC, in no small part because they feared the repercussions, and so did their congregations. Remember that segregation is built on violence. But the SCLC really led the way coming out of Montgomery and the Montgomery bus boycotts. And it's the vehicle for Martin Luther King to operate in conjunction with supportive locals to undertake these actions across the South. These actions for the SCLC, again, were meant to be passive. That is to say that these acts of civil disobedience were not to involve acts of violence or overt violence committed by the protesters. You can take a beating, but you can't deliver a beating, because the ultimate goal is one, and I don't say this lightly, but ultimately it's one of sort of moral, obtaining and maintaining the moral high ground, of appealing to the consciences of Americans and using public pressure and images of people being beaten, especially young people being beaten, using images to influence the way people think about this whole system of segregation. And if necessary, remember this is in the context of the Cold War, appealing to the broader sense Americans may have that they are somehow vulnerable, because here at home, domestically, actions don't always match up with rhetoric. So part of it is it's the idea of public embarrassment, even humiliation, but it's a reminder. It's a reminder of the failures of Americans to live up to their ideals. And that's always a hard pill to swallow. And I think another reason sometimes why Martin Luther King Jr. and the protesters were criticized for opening this window on the other America, how many Americans had to live on a daily basis, an idea that didn't necessarily match the American dream. And yet, as often is the case, it's more complicated than that, because there are varying ideas that develop, always existed really, but certainly become clearly visible by the late 1950s and into the 1960s. And in some ways, this division of ideas is reflected in generational differences. And that's often the case too, historically. You can see it with Native Americans and other groups where you have an older generation that's lived within a system, and they're very reluctant or reticent to call for drastic action, more willing to accommodate and seek moderate reform. Whereas you'll have young people, or people with young minds, maybe that's a better way to put it, who seek change now. And it's that age-old question. If my rights are my rights, why ought I not to have them now? Why should I be patient? Why should I wait another day? we see emerge then, by the late 50s and into the 60s, we see emerge a sort of youth element, a student-led element that works hand in hand with the SCLC. It'll be known as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, SNCC. And gradually, as we move into the 1960s, SNCC will not only play a role in terms of passive resistance, but will develop its own internal struggle as it seeks to move beyond the methods of Martin Luther King Jr. and the movement, the civil rights movement of the 1950s. So we have SNCC, and SNCC will focus initially on the programs, the marches, the interests of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but will begin to move toward more a political fight as the movement moves into the 1960s, a fight for political rights in particular. And we'll talk about that in a later segment, the next segment, in fact. But let me, for now, just give you some sense of what was unfolding in the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. In February of 1960, 4 African-American students who were attending school in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a lunch counter. Now, lunch counter, for those of you who don't know, lunch counters were often part of drugstores or other stores where people did their shopping. You know, they might have a pharmacy and other things. And I'm old enough to remember stores with lunch counters, and stores like Woolworth's, 5 and dime, or 5 and 10, that had lunch counters. The thing is, African Americans were often allowed to do their shopping in these stores, but they weren't allowed to sit down and be served at a lunch counter. The kind of unspoken code of things simply didn't allow it. And if they persisted and became, to use a bad term, uppity about it, then managers might call the police and have them forcibly removed, or there could be violence. You could be attacked if you didn't get off the stool, because these lunch counters were counters that then had stools, fixed stools located around the counters. When these 4 African-American students sit down in Greensboro, North Carolina, what they're actually doing is taking a stool and then refusing to move until they're served. By doing that, they're blocking the access of other customers to the lunch counter. Now, it's an economic tool. It's resistance that's not attacking someone, rather it's resistance that's blocking consumption, blocking this sort of commercial exchange in order to make the point that these African American students aren't being served. We often think of the sit-in in Greensboro, but understand there were sit-ins across the United States. One that comes to mind, and particularly for me, would be the sit-in, or sit-ins, in fact, that occurred in Nashville, Tennessee, the capital of the state of Tennessee, where you had, again, young students who had determined to sit in, and as early as 1959, had actually sent individuals in to make a purchase and then sit down at the lunch counter to be served, just to see what the reaction of the managers might be to these students. They're already sort of testing the waters by 1959, when in February of 1960, then you have the sit-in begin in Greensboro, and it's followed by sit-ins in Nashville and elsewhere across the United States. By the end of 1961, some 70,000 students, 70,000 individuals are involved in sit-ins across the U.S. This is a method of passive resistance, right? I'm not going to get off the stool unless you move me. And there were arrests and there was violence. Imagine having a milkshake dumped over your head, being spit upon or spat upon, having curses and threats of violence hurled at you. And this is hurled not only at young men, but at young women. But the thing was, There's a great deal of bravery you can already kind of see here. Maybe bravery is something that exists among the young. I don't know. But the idea is you've got to maintain control of those stools. And so the way it worked, once these sit-ins got rolling, was you had waves of students in the store. African-American students and sometimes white students who agreed with the necessity of doing away with segregation. And as soon as one student was pulled off the stool, there would be another student whose job it would be to take that stool and sit down. Because these folks knew they were going to be arrested, they were going to be pulled aside, there would be struggles and fights and potentially violence. And there was. So you had to be brave enough to step in knowing what had just happened to the person who had held that stool only moments before. You knew you could easily get the same, but you've got to be persistent. You've got to stay with it. You've got to have the patience to let that economic impact begin to work and let the public relations image get out of young students who wanted an education being arrested, beaten, and threatened. Well, in May of 1961, we have yet another example of this sort of bravery. Some, even within the civil rights movement, thought it was actually quite crazy, foolhardy, to undertake the so-called freedom rides. But the idea was really quite simple. In 1946, the Supreme Court, in the case of Morgan versus Commonwealth of Virginia, had sent down a decision which essentially desegregated interstate bus travel. In other words, because of the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which gave the United States government control over interstate commerce and the regulation thereof, the court reached its decision essentially saying that you simply cannot discriminate on interstate busing. And part of that's because, you could go out of one state to another state and be in violation of the law simply because the laws of the state were different and distinct, yet it's an interstate trip. Well, in May of 1961, in an operation that was in part backed by SNCC, and there were a lot of SNCC participants involved, but also CORE, individuals from CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. In May of 1961, black and white students, many of them from the North, boarded buses. These are, buses that run interstate routes. And their purpose was to test federal legislation that had been passed in accordance with the Supreme Court's decision on interstate busing and discrimination. The plan was to make a trip through the South and through some of the most virulently violent portions of the South, from Washington, D.C. all the way down to New Orleans, Louisiana. Things went relatively well until the Freedom Riders, as they were called, really got into the Deep South. And there are a number of different examples. In Anniston, Alabama, racists set fire to the bus, showing a complete, lack of respect for life and limb. That's how virulent this racism was. And then in Birmingham, Alabama, these students were let off the bus at a station. They were attacked by a mob. They were beaten with pipes and bricks. And the story, as the story goes, Bull Connor, the police commissioner, had essentially let it be known that it would take a while for the police to arrive at the bus station. Implying, in other words, that, you boys have got 15 minutes to beat these people for all you're worth and crack skulls, and then you better have it wrapped up by the time the police show up, because at that point we would have to act. But until that time, you're free to do what you want, and you've got X amount of minutes to get it done. Among the people, if I remember correctly, the people present was John Siegenthaler, who worked with the Justice Department. And, he's sort of witnessing this violence. And it was violent. Whites who were with the African American students as part of the Freedom Rides were singled out in part because they were stepping over these racial boundaries accepted in the South. They were sort of betraying, in the eyes of these vigilantes, they were betraying their race. But African American students were beaten, just horribly, horribly beaten. Many of them had to go to the hospital. So you've had buses blown up, you've had beatings. There would be a mob who greeted Freedom Riders in Montgomery. And I think it's worth telling a story to reinforce this notion of what participation in these events meant. Remember, they're passive. That's the idea of passive resistance. I'm not going to strike back at you. You can beat me, you can do whatever you want. I'm not going to strike back. And there's a moral multiplier there, that moral high ground that's achieved. But I heard Siegenthaler tell a story once. First of all, he's in contact with the Kennedy administration, right? And it's a big problem for the Kennedy administration. How are they going to respond? And particularly for Robert Kennedy, who is the Attorney General, U.S. Attorney General. And ultimately he will respond by sending marshals and also by working out a deal by which the Freedom Rides are concluded, not with beatings or bombings, but ultimately by means of arrests, mass arrests. But to step back just a second, let me go back to my earlier point here, which has to do with just the downright courage it would have taken to participate once you knew what was going on in terms of violence on this Freedom Ride. Diane Nash and John Lewis, both important figures out of Nashville, with SNCC in particular. And if I remember the story correctly, Siegenthaler had called Diane Nash and explained what was happening and said it was foolhardy, if not just, crazy, to send more Freedom Riders. Couldn't we stop this process? And Nash basically explains at one point that, these students that are on their way now to take the positions of the students who have been beaten, to ride the new buses, to continue the Freedom Rides, that these students are well aware of what they face. They've seen the news, they know what's coming, and they're already on their way. They're committed, they're coming. You can't stop this. It's an effort, in fact, by the federal government to try and keep those images of violence in the South and really to keep the evidence of the inactivity, the failure of the Kennedy administration to react, to send in troops, to do what was necessary to maintain the rights, just the rights that these folks, these young people are claiming. And yet the young people themselves are willing to say, I don't care if I'm beaten, I'm willing to face all that to make this statement of principle. It is amazing to me for this and for many other examples. While it's often, sort of sad to think about human history, it's also amazing to me sometimes what humanity and human beings can accomplish. It's always a balance, I suppose, isn't it, in some ways? We continue on talking a bit about higher education very quickly. In October of 1962, and then the following year in 1963, students are admitted to both the University of Mississippi and to the University of Alabama. This is not done without protest, and it's not done without negotiation. Among some of the most important individuals involved in these negotiations will be Governor Ross Barnett of Mississippi, who is constantly in touch with the Kennedy administration. Senator James Eastland of Mississippi, who is involved in working out a deal to arrest Freedom Riders with the Kennedy administration's approval. And also Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who stands at the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to make something of a show of it, to reach out to his Alabama constituency, but also more broadly to the nation and to those national voters who ultimately may reject the intervention of the federal government to achieve desegregation. Wallace doesn't stop the process. Federal marshals explain to him federal law, and he proceeds then to give this speech, which is recorded for the cameras and broadcast on the nightly news. And then, desegregation proceeds. He loses. At least he loses on the battlefield, but it's kind of that New South mentality. Losing on the battlefield, he manages to win in a sort of moral campaign that he's making, a sort of public campaign. 1963, April, May, June, the SCLC and SNCC are active in Birmingham, Alabama. It's that place, remember, where the Freedom Riders are beaten. Television cameras in Birmingham capture the fire hoses and the police dogs and the beatings that occur, especially of youth who are focused around a park there in Birmingham close to the 16th Street Baptist Church. These are all well-dressed young men and women. Again, it's about public image. And Bull Connor, the police commissioner, had initially intended, I think, to arrest many of the protesters, and he had tried to secure jail cells outside of Birmingham so that he could accommodate them. But when that plan failed, he turned to outright violence. These images went across the United States. They went out on the nightly news, and they had begun by 1963 to impact the minds of Americans. In August, then, following up on the pictures coming out of Birmingham, August of 1963, some 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington. Remember that A. Philip Randolph, way back in 1941, had proposed to Franklin Roosevelt that unless there was equality in employment under defense contracts, African Americans would march on Washington. And it's a common theme from Coxey's Army to the Bonus Army, the March on Washington. Well, here in 1963, in August, in late summer, Martin Luther King Jr., the SCLC, SNCC have organized a March on Washington basically about civil rights. It's here at the Washington March that Martin Luther King Jr. gives that great and well-known "I Have a Dream" speech as it comes to be known. The mall there in Washington, D.C., you've seen the pictures, and it's full of people. But I think for me anyway, a more moving event occurs back in Birmingham, Alabama. September of 1963, on a Sunday morning, the 16th Street Baptist Church is bombed. And 4 little girls who were attending Sunday school, sort of in between Sunday school and a later service, were caught in those explosions. I think you have to ask questions. You have to think long and hard about what kind of hate would lead to an event like this. How much is the maintenance of segregation worth? How ingrained was it in Southern society? And I think the argument is it was buried deep, central, at least for those elements that were willing to undertake bombing a church full of people. And yet it was also central for those moderate Southerners who refused to speak out in favor of civil rights and desegregation, who were willing, ultimately, to accommodate. Not long after the 16th Street Baptist Church is bombed, and I encourage you, if you ever have a chance, to head down to Birmingham and take a look at the Civil Rights Institute and at the 16th Street Baptist Church. But in November of 1963, of course, John F. Kennedy is shot in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy, who really had not achieved a great deal on behalf of civil rights for African Americans. Into his place will step Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, whom we'll talk more about in the next lecture, but Lyndon Johnson from Texas, Lyndon Johnson, who was shaped by his experiences during the Depression and with the New Deal. Lyndon Johnson, who had been a relatively conservative Southern Democrat, had moved up through the various levels of American politics to the United States Senate, and then had been sort of the unlikely vice presidential nominee with John F. Kennedy. Clearly, they didn't care much for one another, and certainly Lyndon Johnson didn't care much for Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and vice versa. You wouldn't expect this Texan, necessarily, this Southerner, to be the president probably most responsible for the passage of civil rights legislation in the 20th century during the civil rights movement, and yet it is Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, who takes the reins of power. It's the same Lyndon Johnson that will get us embedded in Vietnam, but in 1964, in June, it's Lyndon Johnson who intervenes with a backroom deal to end a 57-day filibuster, a blocking of voting in the United States Senate to move forward what comes to be known as the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's that act that comes in the wake of the bombing in Birmingham, in the wake of the rioting, the violence in Birmingham, of the March on Washington, the political and moral pressure building throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s. But as I'll mention in the next segment, it's also the outgrowth of efforts by SNCC in Mississippi. This act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, outlawed segregation in public accommodations. This is the first time since Reconstruction. It authorizes the federal government and the Attorney General to use the powers of the federal government to fight black disfranchisement and school segregation. It created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, to investigate and make rulings on discrimination in the workplace, regardless of race, religion, national origin, or gender. If discrimination were discovered, determined to be so, then the United States government would use its powers to withhold funds from public agencies that might discriminate. Lyndon Johnson, sets a new tone in Washington. In the next segment, I'll talk as briefly as I can about sort of what happens with Lyndon Johnson and ultimately how changes in the civil rights movement sort of undermine Johnson and leave him wondering what went wrong. Talk more about that in just a moment.